So again, welcome to our webinar this evening, Modern Families, Fostering Resilience and Inclusivity while Welcoming and Affirming All Families. And we are just so pleased to have two wonderful presenters here tonight from Formed Families Forward. Kelly Henderson, PhD, is Executive Director of Formed Families Forward. A special educator by profession, Kelly is a former public school teacher of students with emotional and behavioral disorders, and has worked in national special education policy and federal research settings. Kelly is also adjunct faculty of special education at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. Kelly's family is formed in part through public foster care and adoption. And Beth Spivak is also here with us tonight, and she's Formed Family Forward Family Support and Outreach Director. She has an MSW and has worked in schools as an addiction specialist and in therapeutic foster care. At Formed Families Forward, Beth supports families and professionals through training and consultations, especially around topics related to childhood trauma, traumatic stress, and building resiliency. And thank you both so much for being here tonight. And thanks again, and we'll get started.
Thanks, Mary Beth. Again, Kelly Henderson with Formed Families Forward, just thrilled to be here. Thank you for making the time for this really broad but very important topic of welcoming modern or traditionally disenfranchised families who might not have been the center of focus and family engagement efforts in the past. So we're going to talk a little bit about who we're talking about in just a moment. But just wanted to introduce myself from the personal lens and then let Beth do the same. We are colleagues at Formed Families Forward. We also bring personal lived experience as families who are maybe not as traditional as some. My family is formed through foster care and adoption. As Mary Beth said, I have three children, all of whom are young adults. One is still in FCPS, all of whom have special needs and who bring a diversity of unique characteristics. Beth?
Yeah, so similar to Kelly, I have I have two children, and one is adopted, and both my children still attend Fairfax County Public Schools.
Thanks, Beth. So I won't spend too much time. Hopefully you at least know our name. And if you don't, we're really glad to meet you. We're Formed Families Forward. We are a nonprofit organization. We are family-led, and we really focus largely on supporting foster, adoptive, and kinship families who are raising children, youth, and young adults with special needs, as well as the professionals who work with our families, be they educators or social service personnel. And if you don't know what foster, adoptive, and kinship families are, you're in the right place, because we're going to talk a lot about that. We do our work basically free of charge to those that we serve. We provide trainings, all kinds of trainings. We do that in person, and we do obviously webinars like this, and we're really pleased that FCPS invited us to share on this topic. So thanks to Mary Beth and her crew. We have support groups free of charge to parents and caregivers that are formed through foster care, adoption, and kinship care. We also have youth support groups. We just concluded an 8-week youth and young adult support group that was open to any type of family structure. We have parenting classes, we have videos, we have lots of resources. We have a holiday party coming up on December 2nd, and that is for foster, adoptive, and kinship families. And if that fits your descriptor, we would love to have you join us. It's a great time. Nice, easy, relaxed evening for families. We are very involved in the issues of trauma. We are participants on 5 of our regional trauma-informed community networks, and Fairfax is one of those. Excuse me. If you're interested in learning more about trauma-informed community networks, and we always encourage family members and family groups to participate in those networks, let us know. Our emails are there at the bottom, and we really do welcome your comments. We're going to cover a lot of things tonight. We don't have a lot of time, but we have a lot of content. And I just want to really be clear on what we're talking about in modern families. We had some questions. So I really want to be clear that we are focusing on strategies to build inclusivity for all children, youth, and families, especially those families who may have been underrepresented, underserved, disenfranchised or marginalized in past. So we're going to use a mix of presenting data and information as well as those practical strategies. And we're going to really build awareness about families that include members who identify as LGBTQ, families that are impacted by disability, as well as foster, adoptive, and kinship families. And we're going to address somewhat step and blended families. So if this is not what you imagined our definition of modern families to be, no harm, no foul. If this is not what you plan to do, we wish you a good evening. But that's sort of our scope this evening, and I want to just set that tone from the beginning. We'll cover all of these other topics again pretty quickly at a fast clip. I want to just start with some context. We have again been invited by the Fairfax County Public Schools Parent Resource Center, and so we wanted to share a few Fairfax County statistics. So we know that Fairfax County and Fairfax County schools particularly, and these data are the FCPS most recently reported data, we know we're very diverse. We have a great deal of racial and ethnic diversity. We have a great deal of actually a little bit higher than average a representation of students with disabilities, those who have IEPs and receive special education. And then the third graph there is a good portion of our families are struggling economically and meet the criteria for economically disadvantaged. So we know that Fairfax is pretty diverse. I want to introduce the idea that we're going to be addressing a number of characteristics that sometimes come at intersections. So there on this slide, this is not Fairfax specific, but is Virginia specific. And this is the federal required special education data. And you can see there in Virginia on the left, they have the resident population, which just means like all kids who are kids and by race in Virginia. And then on the right-hand side, those who are served by IDA or the special education law. And you can see there is, particularly in the dark green, Black or African American, and the dark blue, Hispanic or Latino, those populations are overrepresented or are disproportionately larger than the overall population in the as having disabilities. That also holds true when we use a different definition of disability, and this is the census definition, which is a very much more conservative definition of disability. But you can see the same sort of phenomenon there. In the middle is the line that's sort of the average, and you can see that Black, Indian, Native American, and multiracial children are overrepresented versus some of the other racial groups. So again, I mentioned at the beginning that we're really going to be talking about a number of characteristics and keeping that disability lens in mind. We really will be focusing on these demographic groupings and talking a little bit about particularly the family type and hoping to share some strategies that will be meaningful to you in terms of how to better engage and be inclusive and welcoming to those families. So just orienting again, sort of what we're going to cover in our scope. We want to know a little bit about why you're here. So I think Mary Beth is going to launch this first poll. And again, we're just really interested, and you can mark more than one of these. It is multiple choice. So are there particular areas or aspects of diversity that you are more concerned with, that you feel that you have witnessed or experienced yourself that may have been inaccessible or non-welcoming in your home, in your school, or in your community?
So those are the results, Kelly.
Okay, I'm gonna try to get this box off. I'm assuming you're seeing that. So it looks like we do have some interest in disability, some interest in racial and ethnic diversity, but that there's been maybe a little bit more witnessing or experiencing of gender identity, sexual orientation diversity, and foster adoptive kinship. So that's very helpful. Thank you. All right. So sorry. Okay. So just thought we'd start with some images. These are maybe some families of past. There are some images of what we might have envisioned or identified as a family, maybe a nuclear family in the past, and then also some images of how parents, caregivers, and even teachers have traditionally been given information. So we see what looks to be in the upper right hand corner a standard back to school night, all of the teachers, all the parents and caregivers sort of sitting in rows and listening, to being recipients of information that somebody else is delivering, perhaps the principal, perhaps an assistant principal, perhaps a teacher giving information sort of a one way. And then down in the bottom right, we have, again, perhaps teachers or parents being given information in sort of a classroom setting. I want to contrast that with some pictures of what we might call our modern families, families that do look a little bit different. So I want you to just take a look at those. They're just some of the diversity that is represented in our schools. Really cute pictures. And I'm going to ask you again to respond to a poll after you've looked at those images and think about definition of family. What describes your personal level of experience or familiarity? And again, this is multiple choice. Thanks for participating. I know it's you may be multitasking, so I appreciate you taking the time to respond.
Okay, those were the results of poll 2.
Okay, so it looks like we have a very even distribution of interest areas. So that is awesome. That gives us a really great sense of where we're going. So hopefully we've hit it on the head. Again, we want to just, where possible, infuse some data. So, thinking of this term traditional, thinking of that as a two-parent household, you can see, this is census data, over time, that there has been a decline in what is defined as a two-parent household. And we do know that as new family structures have been legalized and made more legitimate, that some of those two-parent families may look different currently and in the future than in the past. But we've seen this downward trend over time. And that brings us to sort of describing a bit of those family types. So traditional, or what may be, and it's sometimes still in the sociology literature, called a nuclear family. That's a family where typically it's a man and a woman married, and they form their family through birth. We have adoptive families, we have foster families, and we have foster youth who are living in congregate care, meaning a group home or some type of institutionalized setting. We have kinship families, and we're going to talk more about that, but generally it's an extended family member who stepped in to take care of a child, who is usually a blood relative or close family friend. And then we have blended or step families, we have single parent households, and we have divorced couple households. So these are just the terms we're going to be using tonight. So let's talk a little bit about who these modern families are. So as I shared, we're really going to be focusing tonight on finding strategies to build inclusivity. And I want Beth to talk a little bit about building awareness in one particular area of families, and that's LGBTQ. And so Beth, I'm going to let you take it away.
All right. Thanks, Kelly. So we're going to go over we're going to go over some numbers and some data, I think, mostly. So all right. So there are, I think the first thing to note is that there are a significant number of LGBTQ youth and LGBTQ headed families, both locally and nationally. So this is not an anomaly. there are a lot of households that include LGBTQ folks in that house. So first of all, so there's some local data here in Fairfax County. 16.5% of youth identified as gay or lesbian or bisexual, 10% or were not sure of their sexual orientation, 2.6 reported being transgender, and another 3.2 reported that they were not sure if they were transgender. And this data is from the very recent 2021 Fairfax Youth Survey. And then nationwide, between 2 million and 3.7 million children under the age of 18 have an LGBTQ parent, and approximately 200,000 of them are being raised by a same-sex couple, and 29% of LGBTQ adults are raising a child who is under 18. And Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a law professor at Columbia and UCLA, coined the term intersectionality over 30 years ago. So it is a term that has been around for a long time. And she says it's basically a lens for seeing the way in which various forms of inequity often operate together and exacerbate each other. And so certain aspects of who you are will increase your access to good things or your exposure to bad things in life. So first, we'll look at the intersections of identifying as LGBTQ and being in foster care. LGBTQ youth are more likely to be placed in foster care than their non-LGBTQ peers, according to the data. 13.6% of youth in foster care identify as LGBTQ, compared to 2.7% of youth in the general population. 5.6% of youth in foster care identify as transgender, compared to 2.25% of youth in the general population. And then we'll look at the intersections between LGBTQ youth and disability. And these students are at risk for poor outcomes in school, according to data. LGBTQ students with disabilities are affected by issues such as chronic absenteeism, which has been linked to low graduation rates and a higher risk of being put in the school to prison pipeline. And furthermore, LGBTQ students with disabilities were at the highest risk for peer victimization and had the lowest levels of school connectedness. So transitioning from LGBTQ youth to adult LGBTQ heads of household, their children have some challenges as well. So when I say their children, I just want to be clear that they may or may not be LGBTQ themselves. Their children are at a higher risk of grade retention other than children of married heterosexual birth families, but that impact diminished for higher socioeconomic status, same-sex couples, and minimized over time. Children of gay and lesbian parents reported that homophobic teasing or bullying from peers, they reported that as being a negative experience. And gay and lesbian parents and their children also reported that they're less likely to feel alienated and have more favorable experiences overall when school curriculum and policies are explicitly inclusive of them. So research shows that students who feel accepted in their schools reported greater feelings of overall well-being. And now we're going to look at some of the data from the most recent youth survey in Fairfax County. And this survey includes responses from 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. Over 76% of enrolled students took the survey online in 8 different languages. So as I said earlier, almost 17% of teens in Fairfax County self-identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or questioning. LGBTQ students in Fairfax County just did not fare as well as their non-LGBTQ peers. So 32% of LGBTQ peers consider suicide compared to 11% of their non-LGBTQ peers. 14% of LGBTQ students attempted suicide compared to 4% of their non-LGBTQ peers. 50% of LGBTQ students had depressive symptoms compared to 26% of their peers. 21% of LGBTQ students were bullied compared to 12% of their peers, and LGBTQ youth reported feeling less safe than their non-LGBTQ peers in their schools and communities. And so Kelly's gonna cue up a video. So we're gonna watch a short but really informative video that reviews basic terminology about sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And it's really important to understand this information so we can be inclusive of LGBTQ individuals, families, and the community during our interactions.
Hello, and thanks for joining us today. Before we get started with today's live content, we want to talk about some basic terminology that is important to know when working with people who have diverse sexual orientations or diverse gender identities. There are 4 elements of identity that you will need to know: sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. First is sex assigned at birth, which is based on physical anatomy. This is often assigned before or immediately after birth by looking at the baby's anatomy. The most typical sex assigned at birth is either female or male, but there are other variations of sex worth noting. Variation in sex characteristics can be variations among hormones, chromosomes, or anatomy. The term intersex is used as an umbrella term for those born with varying sex characteristics. About 1 in every 100 people are born intersex. That's more common than most people think. So contrary to popular belief, there are in fact more sexes than just male or female. The next important term to know is gender identity. Gender identity is a person's internal sense of their own gender. All people have a gender identity, though not many people think about it. Gender identity is how you feel about your gender and your role in your culture's gendered practices. Gendered practices vary from culture to culture, so there isn't only one way to define being a girl, woman, boy, man, or any other gender. Gender identity forms very early in childhood, with some signs pointing to as early as 2 years old. When young children start to say, "I'm a boy" or "I am a girl," they are describing how they feel about their own gender. I would like to explain a few key terms related to gender identity. The word cisgender describes a person whose gender identity and sex assigned at birth match. The word transgender describes a person whose gender identity differs from their sex assigned at birth. The term transgender is also an umbrella term for gender identities like gender fluid, non-binary, and agender. For more information on these terms, click the glossary link in the description. The next term you will want to know is gender expression. Gender expression describes how people express their gender externally. This could be through clothing, hobbies, mannerisms, or hairstyles. Gender expression and the expectations around expression have changed over time, and they may change day to day depending on how a person feels. Sometimes, one might dress more masculine one day and then decide to dress more feminine the next day. It's important to note that gender expression does not tell us how someone identifies their gender, and it is best not to assume who someone is based on their style of clothing. It's best to ask the person how they identify. Lastly, we will talk about sexual orientation. Sexual orientation describes feelings of attraction. Think back to when you had your last crush. What were the feelings you had? Maybe you felt excited when you saw the person you liked. Maybe you got nervous or shy around them. Or maybe your heart raced and you had attraction. Think back to when you had your last crush. What were the feelings you had? Maybe butterflies. These are all feelings of attraction. Attraction can mean different things to different people. But one thing to note is that these feelings are not a choice or something someone can control. We cannot tell our heart to slow down or our butterflies to go away. Sexual orientation can start to form around early childhood. Think back to when you had your very first crush. This is when your sexual orientation started to develop. Common terms you hear associated with sexual orientation are lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, queer, and straight. Lesbian describes a girl or woman who is primarily attracted to other girls or women. Gay describes boys or men who are primarily attracted to other boys or men. But this term is also used by anyone who is attracted to the same gender. Bisexual refers to people who are attracted to their own gender as well as other genders. Pansexual refers to someone who is attracted to people regardless of gender. Asexual is used to describe someone who may not feel sexual attraction to any gender. This does not mean that the person doesn't want to be in relationships. It just means that the element of sexual attraction is absent. You might have also heard the term queer. Queer is used as an umbrella term that can only be defined by the individual using it. The term continues to be hurtful to some people, especially older populations who experience this term as a slur. However, some people use this term as a source of pride and a symbol of determination. It's always best to use the term only if the person self-identifies as queer, and if the person gives you permission to refer to them in that way. Lastly, some people identify as straight, which means they are attracted to people of the opposite gender. Now that you have some basic terminology under your belt, you're ready to jump into more specific content to get to know this population's experiences better, and to gain skills on how to serve them best.
All right. Hopefully that video was informative to you. If it was new to you, I find that video really, really helpful in about 5 minutes, giving quite an array of definitions and explanations that can really help us build that awareness so that we can be more welcoming. Finally, this is just a graphic. It doesn't address sexuality specifically, but does talk about gender terminology. And it's just a nice graphic that may be something that will be helpful to you as you move forward in your journey. So we're going to move quickly on. We don't have a lot of time, so we are covering, and I mentioned we're covering a lot. We are going to move to a different family type, and that's this big broad category of adoptive, foster, and kinship families, which we at our organization call formed families, as a euphemism for all three types. Just to give a little sense of the context, again, as we did with our LGBTQ families, almost 15% of children in the United States are in homes that are headed by someone other than a birth or step parent. About 2% of children are with adoptive parents, and the rest are kinship, foster, or other unrelated child. We know in foster care in Virginia specifically, about 53, and unfortunately that number sort of creeped back up a little bit. I think it's actually closer to 5,400 children are in foster care at any one time. They do tend to skew a little bit older, and you get a breakdown there of where they are. About 55% are in what we might term traditional foster care, where they're in a home, typically with someone they do not know, is not a relative. So a stranger foster care, someone who has taken on the position of foster care licensed with an agency. Again, foster care is a temporary living situation for children whose parents cannot take care of them. And while they're in care, they can live with relatives. They may be in foster families or in group facilities, or what we call congregate care. And the goal of foster care, really important, is to reunify with the family of origin. in most cases. So again, we have some statistics there about how many are in foster care nationwide. And the last couple bullets talk a little bit about the circumstances about foster care. How do they exit, or their permanency? Goals is reunification with their birth parents, perhaps adoption, perhaps guardianship, perhaps placement with relatives, and then finally, for our older youth, emancipation. And generally, our field is very focused on placing children with kin where possible. There's definitely a swing in that direction. We know that the outcomes for children who are placed with relatives tend to be better than when they're placed with individuals that are unknown to them. So I think we talked a little bit about that. I want to talk just briefly about, kinship care, which is where relatives and close family friends raise a child when their birth parents cannot care for them. And again, I mentioned 15% of all is the umbrella number for all formed families, and the largest chunk of those formed families are indeed kinship providers. So over 10% of children are in households that are headed by grandparents or other non-parent relatives. And there are lots of ways of forming a family through kinship care. There's informal care, where there's maybe short-term or possibly long-term agreement between the birth parent and a kin provider, and that is just happening sort of informally. There's diversion kinship care, where a birth family is being investigated perhaps for some type of abuse or neglect, and that the child can no longer remain in that environment, so they can divert to a relative. And then kinship foster care, where there's officially a foster care case opened, and the foster parent is someone who is a kinship provider. So we're going to give you a chance to learn more. Just as we watched a video about our LGBTQ families, going to give you a chance to watch a video. We don't have time to watch a video on both, but they are in the resources. So we want you to take a poll and tell us, you get only one choice this time. Would you rather watch learn a little bit more about kinship care, or a little bit more about foster care? Both of these videos are fairly brief. Give folks about 30 more seconds or 15 more seconds to respond. All right, I don't see other responses. Oh, now we have a little mix. It's going to be tough if we have a 50-50 split.
All right, it looks like kinship care wins out over foster care.
Okay, great. And again, these videos are available in, whoops. Yeah. All right, so kinship care, and again, this is about a 3-minute video. Really great perspective on this type of family.
In our family, we have 4 daughters. We both had daughters when we got married, and we have 15 grandkids. And so now we have adopted 4 of our grandkids. And so we are now raising 2 boys and 2 girls.
We didn't want our kids to stay in foster care or have to be in a strange place, and we wanted us to be as a family.
Kinship care is one of the most unique things. In kinship, you get a call. And the call is, do you want these kids, or we place them somewhere else? It's just a decisive moment, and most kinship will tell you it's not a choice, though it is, that we're going to take our kids. And so for us, that biggest challenge was say, yes, we're going to take all 4 kids at a moment's decision. But the other part is what families like us go through, financial stuff. We couldn't get food stamps, we couldn't get any other things to help us feed the kids. The vouchers that they used to have were gone. In the old days when I was a social worker, they had the blue book, they had all these vouchers, they had clothing. So even baby clothing was something we didn't get as well. Our church community really supported us and helped us through. But until that time, we felt like we were really alone. And it's really kind of intriguing to see the struggles that we got through. And now we look back and see how successful the kids are and what they're doing well. And sports create another sense of family, another sense of belonging. Also teaches them how to deal with their temper and their anger, especially in boys. And so we couldn't get them into sports, so we adopted them. And that's kind of sad, but they've really they're really talented athletes, and they've really come so far. I'm the only father figure they have in their lives. My wife for 33 years has sacrificed and does. I just want to say, because of her love for this family, her care for the kids, she stayed home and gave up her dreams and things she wanted to do to make sure they have a stable, normal, safe, consistent, resilient environment. The kids have connection.
We're just born to care and take in kids, and this is what I believe that's what God had us to do.
You don't have this support like you do as a foster parent. You don't have certain training as you do as a foster parent. And all of a sudden now you don't even have transportation. And I really feel like the biggest thing is to help families walk through the simple things as filling out application. When you're going through a crisis, even the most simplest task of writing something becomes very complex. And we all make mistakes as parents. But the good thing about kinship or grandparents, we've been through it. So we understand the mistakes we make with our kids, and we try not to make the same mistakes over with our grandkids.
I love that video. And I don't know if any of you noticed, but it's a national video. It's made by the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families at the HHS, but it looks like it was filmed at Mosaic here in Fairfax. So that's a nice little down-home connection. So we're going to move quickly through a couple facts about foster adoptive kinship care. Again, building that awareness of the families that we hope to welcome into our schools, into our communities. We know that there's reasons that children come into care, and they're not pleasant reasons, and there they are. We're not going to belabor that, but obviously it feeds into some of the challenges that these families face as they work to support their children and become integral parts of their school and communities. I don't want to ignore adoption. It's again, about 2% of children are adopted into their homes. And there's a variety of ways that adoption takes place. And happily, this is the beginning of a National Adoption Month. So obviously, lots of the circumstances that bring a child into care of someone that's not a birth parent or step parent do have pretty significant implications. Again, we're not going to get into that. That's a training that we're glad to do and talk to folks about. Excuse me. But it clearly does have these circumstances have an influence on, and that intersection again with things like disability and trauma definitely have an impact on how families can best be served and welcomed. There's some data again on that intersection between disability and foster kinship and adoption. We know that across those populations, be it kinship, be it foster care or adoption, that there is a higher than average likelihood that those individual children will have disabilities or special needs. And I don't want to ignore the step families. Again, another unique care family type that is maybe not traditional, but it is not uncommon. I apologize. Having the end of a cold, I hope. More than 50% of U.S. families are remarried or recoupled. A lot of new marriages are actually remarriages for one or both partners. There are a lot of children impacted by step families, And just an example of one study where there is that intersection of disability, in this case, ADHD, and step families. We actually found in that study that children with ADHD living with step families had greater challenges with some of the behavioral outcomes, behavioral symptomology, than those that were living with single mothers. So our step families are important to recognize and bring a unique set of circumstances and unique to every individual family. But we do know that there is some intersectionality there too. So what are we going to do about all this? And how do we, now that we've again talked about a number of family types, what do we know about how to improve outcomes? And a lot of it is really that relationship. Need one of those cough buttons that they use on TV. So for youth with disabilities, we know, for example, so if we're talking about specific populations, youth with disability self-determination was significantly correlated with parent support and social acceptance. For LGBTQ youth, affirming homes and affirming schools can result in much reduced rates of suicide, depression, anxiety. In foster families, we know that acceptance plays a critical role as those foster youth navigate, LGBTQ youth navigate the foster care system. Foster families can have a really important impact on the child's sense of permanence and safety and care, especially when they bring that LGBTQ identity with them. And then step families, again, some research says that that step parent and step child relationship, the quality of that relationship impacts positively the child's well-being and academic well-being. And then finally, children who have had poor relationships with their father, mother, or siblings report more severe symptoms of depression, anxiety, and externalizing behaviors. So collectively, these are just some samples of what research tells us. That relationship, that strong, supportive relationship with parents, caregivers, is key to to children and youth feeling welcome, feeling accepted. So we'll take that a step further and talk a little bit about specifically what we know related to families who are raising LGBTQ identifying young persons. We know that family accepting behaviors provide a protective layer that encourage a well-being. And you can see that high levels of accepting behaviors result in much higher rates of mental health, overall health, as well as reduced suicidality and better relationships. So again, I think instinctively we know that being welcoming is extremely important. So I'd like to hear a little bit more from you all with poll 4. Whether you're coming, whether you're coming at this from a personal family perspective, a community organization, or a school perspective, what are some of the steps that your family, organization, or school has taken to become more affirming and welcoming? And again, you can mark all that apply.
It looks like we have really consensus across the first 3, Kelly.
Yeah, that's great. That is awesome. And your being here tonight is another example of steps being taken to move us into more welcoming. So thank you for participating. So I wanted to just sort of drill home some of the factors we know, using again the source of data that Beth alluded to earlier with our LGBT data. We know that there are some characteristics, supports, opportunities that really sustain positive outcomes for our youth. And through the youth survey, the researchers have looked at 6 specific protective factors that Fairfax Youth Survey has asked about. We're gonna, so take a look at those. These are questions that youth have answered. As Beth identified, these are youth at 8th, 10th, and 12th grade, and some 6th graders are given the survey. And these are 6 factors that are asked about, and then you can see what they have found. If I get my mouse back here. That when a child reports at least 3 of these factors, the outcomes for those individuals are much more positive. So these are across the bottom, the number of protective factors. So the more that a child reports having these factors, the less stress, the less depressive symptoms, the less suicidality a child reports as well. I'm just going to go through these next couple. You can learn a lot more about the survey if you have interest, but you can see the same pattern with alcohol use and binge drinking. The more protective factors in place, the less likely those behaviors are to occur in our youth. And the same with use of illegal drugs. Again, more protective factors, the higher the outcomes. So I actually asked a colleague, Jessie Ellis, who is a guru of all things with the youth survey, to take a look and at some correlations, specifically with these welcoming characteristics, the protective factor about having a community adult available to talk. And you can see that there are some differences here in the results, in what the students report in terms of outcomes. It is those who have community adults to talk to are much more likely to have higher grades. They are also much more likely to be in school. So you can see the difference there. So again, the protective factor of having a community adult to talk to, a neighbor, someone in their school club or sport, someone to talk to, does have positive outcomes. And the same holds for parents. I think the term is actually used in the survey as parents, but we know that in some, again, more than 10% of cases, that may be a kinship caregiver. And we see that same relationship hold. Again, these are not causal data, but they are correlational, and it says to me and indicates that the more supports, the more welcoming supports that an individual child has, the better their outcomes in school. So there is a connection. So let's talk a little bit more about how to sustain families within the school and within the community. And I put these 2 pictures up here, just looking through clip art. And I just thought this really drilled home some of the messages that we hope to, the reason that we're even having this conversation. When I looked for images of families being supported, the image on the left was typical of what I found. And I think while it's a lovely image, it's very heartwarming. The fact that that is a very traditional family structure, you see a man and a woman and a boy and a girl being held in a very homogeneous hand picture. So that was available out there in the clip art world and in searching widely, and it was very hard to find images of families being supported by community that were not sort of this traditional conception of families in the dominant culture. So that's a concern, that if we are trying to make our schools and our community organizations more inclusive and more welcoming, and these are the kinds of clip art that are available, I think it reinforces some of the challenges we have ahead. So rather, I like going to nature and this idea instead of a bird's nest. So thinking of our families as those eggs within the nest of school, and then that school being embedded in a community is sort of the frame I'd like to use as we have the rest of our conversation about strategies. We know that welcoming family engagement matters. This is decades and decades of research that reinforce that when we have families engaged, and I mean really engaged, authentically engaged, that student outcomes increase, they have higher achievement, they have higher attendance, they have less school dropout, their social behaviors are improved, and their peer affiliations are stronger. And their outcomes also hold for parents and caregivers and for teachers. Parent efficacy and competence is higher when there's strong family engagement. There's stronger trust of teachers by parents and caregivers. Teachers are happier, and that parent-teacher relationship is perceived as stronger. So that's a whole presentation I love to give about the importance of family engagement and how do we know that it really matters, but we do, there's no question. So let's talk a little bit about these images of what is that welcoming family engagement, whether you are a PTA leader, whether you're a parent at a school, whether you're a school leader and you're a school teacher and you're trying to increase welcoming opportunities for your families. So we do see that there are traditional ways of engaging families. Come to a hot dog fundraiser and help us raise money for the PTA, which again is an opportunity for families to come at a certain time and space and participate. But there are also other ways that may be more inclusive of our non-traditional or modern families. And so, you know, I see these pictures and I see in the upper right opportunity for families to come and learn with their children. You see the children there on the left, you see the family members on the right, in a classroom together. So co-learning, learning the skills that those families may benefit from to reinforce what's happening at school. Parent communication log, the two-way communication log. We see traditional things like parent volunteers, where we just want folks to come and serve the good of the school, which again is one great way of engaging, but may not be feasible for everyone. And again, on the left, I see who I think is a parent learning with his or her child. So thinking a little bit about those authentic collaborations, we really need to make sure that we are focusing on finding opportunities to encourage equitable collaboration. And that includes recognizing that non-dominant families or non-traditional families in some cases may be a huge source of skills, experiences that can really boost equity and justice in our schools. So finding ways to really refute that idea that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and rather to find those assets that families offer, even if it doesn't look the way that traditional assets have looked. Being able to come and raise money, being able to come and volunteer in the school, being able to come to a parent-teacher conference at 2 o'clock on a weekday. So, you know, really thinking about the font of knowledge and skills and expertise that all families, modern families too, bring. So the strategies we're going to go over are not just for our traditional family engagement specialists, but ways that can be really inclusive and welcoming of all families, whether that is the classroom or the school or a sports team or a PTA or another community-led organization. So we really want to emphasize that these are not just good strategies for schools, but good strategies for anyone working to engage families. And so here is a set of key family engagement approaches, again, very much rooted in research. We want to always assume that the most effective and efficient way to support a child is the kind of support that they receive from their family. So the family is the center and the expert on their children. We need to make sure that we're defining engagement at all levels, and that those engagement efforts are linking to systems and practices. So they're not just one-offs, but truly embedded in the systems and practices across schools, across settings. We want to actively engage families. We want to do with families, and some of those pictures might have alluded to not just two families. You don't just want you sitting and receiving information. in a back to school night, but we want you to actually engage with us as our organization, as a school, and collaborate to find better ways that improve outcomes for all children. And I think I'm just going to pick one more of these that we really want to differentiate. That last bullet, I think, is really important. One size fits all does not work. We need to really think about unique ways that make engagement accessible to all families. One piece of this, I think, is an important recognition that our traditional families may have, our traditional families have certain qualities that increase their ability to influence what's happening at a school or in a community. They have these powerful characteristics that may come with wealth, that may come with privilege, that may come with the ability to be independent, may come with status. And so it's really important to be as inclusive and welcoming as we want to be, to really begin to face up to the history and the experiences that give certain groups more power. And so inherently our systems and our entrenched ways of doing things with and sometimes to families have really yielded power for certain groups, certain types of families, and that sort of perpetuates itself. It reinforces expectations and sort of continues on a cycle that may be exclusionary of certain groups. So a true rebalancing of power that values the assets of families that have lived experience is really key, and that's hard stuff. That's hard stuff because we're talking about changing perhaps very long held traditions and ways of work. Communication is really key to beginning to change our way of work. We know that communication serves many purposes. It gives information, we get information through strong communication, we build relationships, we express our needs and our feelings, we can boost social interaction, and it is a way of advocating. I think that sometimes as we begin to use a broader lens, begin to think about being more welcoming and more inclusive, we sometimes get a little nervous about including other cultural or identity groups because it's unfamiliar to us. And so we don't want to say the wrong thing, we don't want to do the wrong thing. And so we sometimes feel uncomfortable, and we tend to resort to ways of doing that have served us in the past. So when in doubt, always good idea to just simply ask. If you're not sure of how best to include a group, you're not sure what the group could benefit from, what their preferences might be, asking is a really safe bet, and being comfortable with that ask is a skill and a level of comfort that we have to begin to be acting in, to really be able to move within that interest of shared exploration, shared learning, and shared understanding. So let's talk a little bit about what that inclusive communication might look like, particularly for our unique family structures or modern family structures. So we have to really be careful about assumptions. That's where asking becomes really important, because we can fight those assumptions. Words like parents, words like mom and dad, boys and girls, all of those can be terminology that can reduce the welcoming approaches, welcoming opportunities. Economic availability is also one. There's often, as we work within schools and PTAs and organizations, some assumptions in working with sports leagues, for example, that a club that all families can pay those club fees, or can buy the t-shirts, or can buy the supplies for the projects. And so I think we have to really think a little bit differently. Well, that's always been the letter we use, that we send this letter out, and everybody's expected to return their $15 with the enrollment form, and that can be very exclusionary. Another thing I want to raise, particularly with our disability lens, is person first language. And I put the word generally there because there is an increasing preference by some disabled populations to identify the disability first and not use the person first language. And that's great. The way we know that is by asking, is to simply say, what is your preference? But person first language is the idea that we're talking about using the individual and then the disability second. So learners who have developmental delays, not developmentally disabled children. So generally person first is preferred, but again, individuals may have different preferences. For example, individuals who are deaf may prefer to be called a deaf individual and identify as a deaf community member. And we're seeing similar interest with the term autism and those who are on the autism spectrum. Assessing the time and place for communication that will work for all families. So I think that's really important. We make certain assumptions that, oh, well, if I send something out at 5 o'clock in the evening, that's going to be the best time for everyone because everybody's gathering back home after their day at work. Well, that may not be the case for every family. So really having options for on-demand information where possible, rather than pushing out at a certain day or time in certain formats that are really only accessible to a certain group of folks. And then considering confidentiality and minimizing demands for group sharing. I see this sometimes as I've done my time. I mentioned I'm a parent of 3. In helping to plan events for the elementary school, for example. There's often opportunities where a group or subgroup of parents who are planning an event get together and we're introducing, and there's an opportunity to, as you go around, talk about your child's favorite subject last year. Well, that assumes that everyone in the group had their child in their care last year. So it does make some assumptions about children who may not have been in that family in the past, as one example. Another classic for our foster adoptive kinship is the sharing the baby pictures at the 6th grade celebration, at the 6th grade graduation. Do we have alternatives to that? Do we really, that can be very challenging for families who may not have baby pictures of their children, or can't access those because the child is not in contact with their birth family. Written communication. Love to talk a little bit about written communication because this is where sometimes the miss is really apparent. And this comes from Patricia Weinzappel, who writes a lot about homeschool communication and the way that she's a marketer and not an educator. And so she really talks about thinking differently about how we reach out in our communications to families. So she makes some really good suggestions, obviously very simplified language, avoiding acronyms, which is a very common practice in education and even in our family organizations and clubs and groups. Being active, using an active voice over a passive voice, and really using a very conversational style versus formal grammar, that we want to reach families with language that is most comfortable for them. So I think I know we would have minimal participation in person, but let's go ahead and do our last poll. We talked a lot about the communication strategies, reviewed a lot, but is there one that you resonated with that you might be willing to adopt in the future? And you only get one choice on this one. Okay, it looks like we have increasing attention to person first language and asking instead of assuming. Yeah, those are both hard, particularly the asking instead of assuming. because it does presume that we have a comfort level with asking and recognizing that we don't know it all, and that the way that we've done things in the past may not be the way that we want to proceed. I'm going to wrap up with just some more of the very specific family type strategies. Again, just some, as we think about our LGBTQ youth and the families in which our LGBTQ youth are being raised, just some opportunities for those who may not identify with that population personally. You have opportunities to be an ally. You have the opportunity to be a straight person who supports and advocates for LGBTQ. And there's lots of ways of doing that. Schools can implement policies and procedures and activities that promote the healthy environment. I like to show this because this is from our friends at GLSEN, who are educators that are working to make more inclusive school and education settings for LGBTQ youth. And they have this sort of simple four component set of practices. So having anti-bullying and anti-discrimination policies, having school staff that are supportive of those. And we talked so much about that earlier, about the importance of having those relationships with teachers and parents. Gender and sexuality alliances, often called GSAs, and then having a curriculum that's LGBTQ inclusive. And again, in terms of just practicing when you're talking about and with LGBTQ youth and their parents and caregivers, preferred pronouns. We're seeing an increasing use of that, making sure that any disrespectful language, and even if it's unintended, is sort of halted and recognized and called out, advocating for rights, incorporating LGBTQ friendly identifiers in clothing or office decorations. So the rainbow flags are sometimes one, or symbols may be important in your school or community setting. Checking those assumptions about what clothing matches an individual's gender identity, becoming more knowledgeable about resources. And we have a list at the end of this slideshow that has lots and lots of resources that can be helpful, including this from, again, our friends at Fairfax County Youth Survey are encouraging folks to connect with the Family Acceptance Project. They have these wonderful posters. If you are a family member who has a child who is identifying as LGBTQ, or are an ally and working in a school or a community organization to support, they have these great posters in all languages. I think there's like 15 languages that they offer them, and that really provide very straightforward suggestions on how to increase inclusivity and welcoming behaviors. How can you as an individual react, respond, and support? An example, it's hard to read this, so I picked one out. Ask your LGBTQ or gender diverse child if and how you can help them tell others about their identity. So just really simple like strategies and behaviors that do contribute to that welcoming environment. For our foster, adoptive, and kinship families, I want to just recognize there are some specific behaviors and strategies that can be challenging and helpful. Assignments at school or topics within club meetings or other community settings that may assume birth family connections can be challenging, can be those sizzling, challenging topics, so that we might want to consider altering our assignments related to autobiographies or family trees or mapping genetic traits. Because for a lot of children, that may not be an option for them, information that they may have at their fingertips. Concerns about sharing information, confidentiality information, and lack of information on the birth family. So again, really important to be cognizant that information may not be available or may not be comfortable for an individual to share. Important to frame the challenging behaviors as an unmet need. This is probably the case for all families, but particularly in our foster, adoptive, and kinship families, we know that the impact of trauma can really create some reactions and responses that are challenging to caregivers, to parents, and to folks in the school and community. And so we really want to try to get behind those behaviors and look at what that function behind the behavior is, before making assumptions that that child is trying to just be disrespectful or insubordinate. Lots of social emotional issues, particularly around adjustment and attachment in our foster adoptive and kinship transitions, whether a child is transitioning from one home to another, transitioning between schools, between classes, new content. Transitions generally are an area of stress for a lot of kids, but particularly for kids who have a sense of unsafety with transitions. And so being really careful and cognizant of those. And then we know that teacher preparation really does play a pivotal role to make sure that foster adoptive and kinship students, children, youth, and young adults and their families really are getting the best possible services and supports that they need to lead to increased learning and achievement. So it does pay off to have teacher training and staff training on issues that are specific to trauma and specific to foster adoptive and kinship families. And finally, we just wanted to offer a few sort of good for any family strategies that can help increase outcomes for all kids, and particularly in school. Getting to know your students, teachers, getting to know other staff that are connected. Maybe those are the clinical personnel in your school. Communicating regularly with the school, not just on the stuff that's bad or worrisome, but even the good things. Having structured routines and schedules and organizational factors, like having that landing pad where everything can be placed, and when we're in a rush, that you know where to find things, can really alleviate stress and make transition smoother. Building community within a community may be really helpful. Finding other parents or relatives that may have similar family types or have lived experiences that are similar to what you're going through, but have done that, have navigated in the past, may be very helpful. And then making sure that you're actually sharing information that may be extra sensitive or unique proactively. We have a tool to help with that. It's called our All About Me sheet. There are variations of this sheet, but this is one we like because it does address specifically information that might be unique or sensitive, and clarifying it in the you should know, and then clarifying whether that information is for consumption or sharing broadly, or is private information. But this is a great tool for families and youth themselves to share key and critical information with staff members at school or even in community organizations. And finally, to end on a very positive note, one strategy that serves us all well, whether we're supporting families, supporting youth, supporting kids in our own home, supporting kids in the community or in community settings, sports clubs, sports leagues or clubs, is an affirmation. An affirmation is a positive reminder or statement that is encouraging and motivating. It helps us feel strong and helps us feel optimistic about change. And we talked about that sort of moving a needle towards more inclusive and welcoming environments, and inclusive and welcoming actions is going to take change. And sometimes that's hard and uncomfortable. But there's brain science about how affirmations can be helpful to help us feel strong, to be optimistic about the changes in your life. So whatever the setting, affirmations can be used to motivate and encourage, especially if you are a leader in your family, a leader in your community organization, a leader in your school, that may be guiding us through hard changes to be more inclusive and welcoming. So an affirmation might be, we are capable of this change. We are smart. We are ready to unite. We are ready to welcome. So just really talking about that. It could be an individual or it could be a group affirmation. And finally, as I mentioned, there are a whole host of resources on particularly two specific family types, LGBTQ families and foster adoptive kinship families. Really good information there for your use another time. And if you are interested in learning more about Forum Families Forward, or just joining us on social media. We do post lots of information for our region in terms of events and opportunities for families who, again, may not be our traditional families, but have unique needs and can make huge contributions if welcomed.
All right, Kelly, thank you so much. I just wanted to let everyone know that I'll be, when I follow up with everyone, I will be putting these resources in the emails, and so you'll have access to that. And certainly Kelly is graciously going to share a copy of the slide, so we'll be able to get that out to everyone as well. I did put a couple things in the chat. We do have many resources on all the different family types that Kelly talked about today in our library, and we would love to share those with you. And so I put a link to our library, and then certainly give us a call if you would like any other resources or need some help with the resources that you may have seen. And then highly recommend reaching out to Kelly's organization, Forum Families Forward. I had put that in the chat earlier. I will say, if you follow the PRC on Twitter, I always retweet everything from Foreign Families Forward. So, just to make sure that you're aware of the events, and they're amazing. So please if you have any questions, please put those in the chat. I know Kelly we have about 10 minutes left. If people have any other questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. Okay, give people some wait time. Kelly, maybe you could talk about maybe just some upcoming either programming that you all may have for young people, children, adults. What might you have coming up at Forum Families Forward?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. So I mentioned we have a holiday party on December 2nd, and that is for foster, adoptive, and kinship families. Most of what we do is open to anybody. Our trainings is open to anybody, but that is a party that is sort of specific to our families, that they can feel comfortable and welcome within the arms of our community. So that's on December 2nd. Information is available to register for that on our website. We have a great book study coming up, and so whether you're coming to this work from a professional lens or a personal lens or both, the book study is on the book What Happened to You by Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey, which is a great introduction to some of the adverse childhood experiences and trauma sensitive practices work. And that book study starts in January. We will get you the book, and it's a really great opportunity to collaborate both from a family lens and a professional lens, to sort of come together and have some conversations about what do we know, what do we know about improving our practices and responses to children, families who have been impacted by trauma, and where can we go to build resiliency. So we're really excited about that. We will have a series in January on fetal alcohol spectrum disorders that is fairly common amongst our foster, adoptive, and kinship family community. It presents a set of unique challenges in school and in home settings, as those children do have significant, often neurodevelopmental responses, that neurodevelopmental deficits that do sometimes cause real challenges in finding settings and approaches that are going to work for them. So that's just a little teaser. We do have our support groups, again, continuing on for parents and caregivers, and we will have youth and young adult support groups starting in winter. Again, probably an 8-week session. I see Nina is here, and she's on our staff and does a great job with our parenting classes. And those will start back up in 2023, including Spanish offerings. So parenting classes in Spanish. So we're really excited
wow.
to expand in that. So
No,
yeah, lots
that's
of
great.
things.
All right, Kelly, thank you so much. Well, I don't think we have anyone with any questions, but I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. And Kelly, thank you again for all the support that you give our families in Fairfax County Public Schools. And we appreciate everyone's participation tonight. And Kelly, thank you again.
Thank you.